Welcome back to Season 2 of the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and I am so grateful that you're joining us. When I started this podcast last year, my primary goal was to normalize the experience of imposter syndrome, to make it easier for us to talk about, and to access the support that we deserve. I am so grateful to everyone who has shared their stories with me, and I'm fascinated by the linkages between imposter syndrome and so many other facets of our lives. The conversations that we had last season led us in so many powerful directions. I'm excited to continue these conversations in Season 2. As always, if you have a story to share, please reach out to me. I would love to interview you. And if I can ever support you on your own imposter syndrome journey, I'd love to connect on that too. Thanks again for being here. Welcome, Kate. I am so happy to have you here today. Can't wait to have this conversation with you. And before we jump in, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and share a little bit more about you.
My name is Kate Pilato, and I work for T-Mobile. And I actually have the title of senior admin, but the work I do is business intelligence, analytics, reporting, and that's something I just finished a degree in and have been working on getting a full-time position that focuses on that kind of work.
Excellent. And I will ask you the standard question that I ask everybody, which is, what does imposter syndrome mean to you? And as an extension of that, how, if at all, has it shown up in your world, whether in your life or in your career?
I don't think there's any part of my life where imposter syndrome has not been something. As far as what it means to me, it's essentially not being enough, either smart enough, pretty enough, funny enough, whatever applies to the situation. But as a wife, as a mother, as a writer, and in my professional life, I've never really felt like I'm enough of anything, or that I belong, or that I have anything to offer So it was really funny. At one point, you had mentioned wanting people on your podcast, and at the same time that I'm thinking, yeah, I know a little bit about this one, the exact same time, my brain goes, well, who wants to listen to what you have to say? Why on earth, should they want to listen to you? And I was like, and that's why I need to do this.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Wow. Do you have a sense of where that comes from? Not to get too personal, obviously this is not a therapy session, but you mentioned that it's pretty pervasive. Have you connected it to anything?
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely, it traces back to when I was young, and a lot of things about my upbringing and stuff in my past that it feeds. I've also battled depression for the majority of my life, and I deal with anxiety, but I think it all just kind of rolls in together. The thing that I've realized more and more as I get older, though, is in a lot of ways that's letting all of those events kind of control me. And I don't have to do that. I don't have to let them control me in that way.
I think that's a really powerful place to be when you can see your life in those terms, right? Because I think if we don't, first of all, acknowledge that connection, where is this actually coming from? And then, like you're saying, reframe it in such a way that it doesn't maintain the kind of power that it has traditionally had, then we really don't have a whole lot of hope to address it any differently, or to think about it any differently than we always have. So how did you get there?
A lot of it, I either credit to or blame, depending on how you want to look at it, my daughter. She is 17. She's heading into her senior year of high school. She is an amazing person in every way. I was a single mom for 11 years, and it was literally just the two of us. I didn't date. I didn't have anybody else in her life. Her father's never been in her life. So we have a really, really unique and intense bond. And as she's got older and she's been more me, part of it is that she's this amazing person, and she is like mini me in so many ways. And the other part is, as she's discovering herself, she's flat out said in a number of ways that I inspire her. She asked if she could write her college entrance essay on me and the way I raised her and the way our lives have gone and what I've done for her. And it's like looking at myself through her eyes makes it easier to see those things that don't have to be that way. And the more I can see them, once you can recognize them and find them, it's easier to tackle them.
Wow. That's really powerful too. The way you're describing it is kind of seeing yourself reflected back through how she sees you, and I don't have daughters. I have 2 sons that are younger, but I was a 17-year-old daughter at one point. And I don't know that I necessarily would have had that same, I don't know, effect on my mother. So it sounds like you have a really great relationship, which is wonderful.
Yes. Yeah, I am so blessed in every possible way with her. I've told her before, I don't know what I did in a past life, but boy, was it good.
That's really inspiring in and of itself. So how does the way that you have been rethinking about yourself and this whole concept of imposter syndrome, how does it show up in your current life? Are you making different choices? Are you noticing differences in how you manage yourself, your career?
Definitely. The first thought in any situation is the same as it's always been. It's I can't do this because, or I shouldn't do that because, and that negative voice of I'm not good enough for it, so I need to just sit back. But as I'm hearing that voice in my head, it's like, no, I'm going to do this. And sometimes I don't always know why I'm going to do it. And 100% of the time, if I don't do it right that second and commit, I will talk myself out of it. So it has to almost be an impulsive behavior. But I want advantages. I want things to change. And they're not going to change just because I want them to. They're only going to change if I make them change. So if I don't take those risks and put myself out there, then being unhappy in my situation is no longer anybody's fault but my own.
And that's such an empowering way to see it, right? Because the alternative is to be a victim who's at the mercy of external forces that are entirely out of your control.
And a lot of those forces are sometimes have nothing to do with me. They affect me or they make something happen to me or with me, but what's behind it has nothing to do with me at all. So it highlights even more the utter lack of control you have over that surrounding stuff. And the only thing I can really control is the way I react to it and the responses I have and the actions I take.
I love how you say that the first thought is still the same, because I think that's a really important piece for those of us who are on this journey to remember. The thoughts don't really go away. They are there by design. I often think of them as an expression of our primitive brain that wants to keep us safe and will say whatever is necessary to keep us from moving forward. It's like a overactive bodyguard in some ways. But it's what you do with those thoughts. And so the way that you're describing it is, the thoughts are going to happen, but looking at them differently or taking a different action than you might have in the past allows you to move in a new direction.
Yes. And some of the things it traces back to my role as a mother, in that I don't want my daughter to be almost 40 years old and have a laundry list of regrets over things that you can't change. And honestly, I wouldn't want to. If I changed even one thing in my life right now that happened in the past, then everything in this moment could be different. And that's not worth it to me. But there are so many things that I talked myself out of, or so many times I just sat back and kept my mouth shut, kind of like, maybe if I ignore it long enough, it'll just go away. But what happens is the problems don't and the opportunities do. So I haven't really done anything good for myself or anybody else by sitting back and waiting for it to pass.
Ooh, I like that.
And I regret that. So but how do I teach her those things and then not do it myself?
Well, you bring up another really good point, which is that a lot of what drives us is the desire to support others, right? So it may be less of a priority, and we could argue whether that's legitimate, right? But we may be less of a priority for us to do work for its own sake, for our own development. But when we look around and see an opportunity to do that in a way that impacts others, it takes on a lot more motivation, right? So you're talking about your daughter. I think there are other people who think, I want to be a stronger role model for my team or in my community. There's something really powerful about connecting with that value and saying, I want to do things differently for my own sake, but also because I want to have a larger impact on the people around me.
Yes, absolutely.
So are there particular times when it's really hard? Like, do you notice any trends or themes? Because I think we're always a work in progress. It's always going to take time to get to, as you and I were talking about previously, build these muscles, right? Are there particular types of things or, whether it's in the workplace or in your personal life that are harder to manage than others?
Times of change, like especially a disruptive kind of change, like deciding to seek out a new job and all of the things involved with that, between applying, interviewing, reaching out, talking to my current boss about it, things at home with, we're looking at having a fairly big move next year after my daughter graduates. And at the same time, we're looking at moving her because she'll be going to college, and they're major, massive things. And it's really easy to succumb to the temptation of I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm not the right person to have a say in this, even though it's my life. And I'll just sit back and deal with it. It's definitely much more prevalent and a lot harder to beat down.
Mm. And you mentioned change, which is a fairly universal trigger of imposter syndrome. And I think it ties to that bodyguard that we were talking about, because change equals uncertainty, and uncertainty in our minds equals danger. And so when things are changing, we feel anxious and unsafe. And so I think just noticing when that's happening and even anticipating it, that things are going to look very different a year from now. So even though there are certain things that you're starting to worry about today or that you're noticing are harder to manage in terms of your thoughts today, there may be any number of things on the horizon that you can't anticipate, but knowing that they're coming, I think, sort of, okay, what's my plan for recognizing these thoughts as they show up? And what are my support systems to help me through them when they do?
I have a couple quotes that I hang on to. I don't have them posted or anything, but I have them saved on my phone for when I need them. And one of them is, if there were no change, there'd be no butterflies.
Mm-hmm.
And I love butterflies. I always have there in a lot of places in my house. It was my first tattoo. It's always been a big thing in my life. And that's nice to kind of tie together to this figure that I've loved. With no change, there'd just be a lot of caterpillars.
I love that. I think that's such a great image. And I talk a lot about change management and just kind of getting through the anxiety that we inevitably encounter during those moments. And it's a similar philosophy that imagine the alternative, right? If you're not changing, maybe you're more comfortable, but what's the cost of stagnation, right? What is the cost of never feeling challenged, of never actually growing and trying something new? I think we have to consciously balance those two things and figure out where our values lie, what's most important to us, and knowing what that is will help give us even more strength to move beyond the anxiety and the fear that are just central to that whole experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Are there other support systems, things that you do to, like, people you lean on, or strategies you use when you find it getting hard to work through some of these things that we're talking about?
I would say my daughter is definitely my number one supporter and my rock that I lean on. And also quite often the shoulder that I cry on, and the hug that I go for when I need it. And it's great because we are that for each other. So it goes both ways quite a bit. But the other thing I do is I've been writing since I was 4 years old. Literally, I have stories from that long ago.
Wow.
And it is the one thing in my life I have been truly passionate about and has truly made me happy to do. And so I'll just, sometimes when it's kind of building up, I'll open up my computer and start working on something that I've got going on, or even something new, and just lose myself in that. And then I kind of come out the other side and I'm all wrapped up in my characters and what's going on. And then it's like I look at the whole situation differently.
Wow. So what are you said characters. Are you writing fiction? It's not, doesn't sound like journaling. It sounds like you're writing something more imaginative.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I write fiction, primarily fantasy.
Wow. That's really great. I mean, I think writing is a really powerful strategy, whether doing it the way that you're describing, or even sometimes just writing down what we're thinking and how we're processing information, because we tend to think that we have our thoughts clear when they're swirling around our head, but the act of translating them is really, really powerful. And I would imagine that you can even see, and I'm guessing here, but themes in your own writing as you have evolved and matured over since you were 4, right? to kind of look deeper into what does this tell me about where I was in my life at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I tried journaling and doing diaries for a while, but because of my propensity to overthink everything and question everything I say and do, I found I was doing that while trying to write it out in a journal, and kind of looking at it as I wrote it, more judging it than just writing it. Whereas when I'm writing fiction, pretty much all of my characters my main characters are some piece or part of me. And it's just very cathartic to put that out there in a situation that I'm fully in control of because I'm writing it, and kind of work out those things and watch as my characters grow. It's almost like I can grow with it when I go back and look, because it's so me.
I just think that's such an interesting psychological strategy too. Like, you're talking about the ability to create distance between yourself and your experience, because there is so much self-judgment, and it is really hard to be objective when we're talking about our own experiences. And so if it isn't helpful to journal for the reasons you're describing, or for any other reason, I think that's a great recommendation to anybody who might be so inclined, right, to think about writing it in a more fictional way, but it's still, as you mentioned, an extension of yourself, right? We write what we know, we write who we are. So I love that as a recommendation to others.
Well, and it's never intentional. It's always at some point in the book, I realize, hey, you know what?
This is familiar.
Oh, okay. I know where this came from.
I just think that's so great. That's such a great resource and a great skill to have. How do you think about, so one of the things I think a lot about is just the cumulative effect of imposter syndrome in the workplace and the fact that, it is so pervasive. One of the reasons why I started this podcast is because I don't think we talk about it enough. And most people individually are ashamed to say it out loud. So that makes it scary for everybody else. If there's so many people around us each day that are struggling with this silently, imagine the impact it has on the workplace, on business more generally. Do you see this in your workplace? Are you conscious of it showing up in other people besides yourself?
I don't really. And I'm not saying it's because I work entirely with men, because I'm sure there are men who deal with it too. But I think it's probably that because they're raised a little bit differently and the approach is different, that it's not something that would ever be said or that they would make very obvious. I mean, all of the men I work with constantly seem like, yep, I got this, I own it, I'm totally cool with it, and just kind of stand in a room and start talking and seem 100% comfortable with it. And so they either hide it really, really well, or I work with a lot of men who don't have this problem.
I'm sure it's a little of both. It's absolutely true that men experience this as well. And it's absolutely true that because they're socialized differently, may feel even less comfortable saying it out loud. So I'm sure that there are individuals who experience it and there's no way of knowing that. But I do think that one of the other key triggers of it is feeling different from the people around you. And so if most of the men in your group feel alike in some way and included, they feel a sense of belonging, it's less likely that they will experience this, at least in more disruptive ways. So how's it been for you being the only woman?
Primarily, I have actually enjoyed it. In a previous job, I managed a department and I supervised 36 women. And that's where I learned that I don't want to be a manager ever again. So working with all men was actually a really, really nice change. There were a lot of things about that job that weren't fantastic, but there were cliques and there was cattiness and there was backstabbing and all those stereotypical female things. And it just left kind of a bad taste in my mouth. And so coming to all men was like, all right, I can cope with this. And a lot of times I have no issue being one of the guys. I tell the same dirty jokes. I have a potty mouth, and I get along really well. A lot of them are like work out in the field. And so they're just rough and tumble Joes. And we relate pretty well. I actually have a harder time relating to the managers.
Yeah. And it is kind of arbitrary how we slice and dice the people around us, right? So just because they're men and you're a woman doesn't automatically mean that you're going to feel different in some type of meaningful way. But I think it's helpful to acknowledge where there may be a sense of I'm different, right? Like you mentioned managers, just in general for each of us to reflect on, are there situations that trigger this more than others? And what is it about that situation? Is it a certain personality type? For introverts, it may be being in the room with a lot of extroverts, it could be anything, but just knowing what it is and being able to name it takes some of the power out of it. And it also gives us an opportunity to shift blame from ourselves, which is our natural tendency when we feel different from the people around us, is to look around and say, well, there must be something wrong with me, right? Why am I not more like them? I'm less than in some way. And so rather than accepting that as reality, noticing, oh yeah, that's right. When I feel different, I notice myself feeling this way, and it's not in any way a reflection on me or my value. It's just a natural part of this experience.
Well, and to your point, so one of my duties is to organize events, get-togethers, things like that for everybody to come and like our holiday party or picnics or things. And I love organizing things. I love setting things up. But if I could organize it and then pay for it and not have to go, I would be so much happier. Because we get in that situation, and I already struggle with social anxiety primarily. But on top of feeling anxious socially, whether or not I know the people there, which I do, we have departments in our organization, and each of them belong to one of those departments, except me. I don't have a department. And although I spend the majority of my time with the managers, I'm not a manager. So they all kind of cluster in group, and I'm standing there like, I don't fit in. I don't belong here. I don't have a group. There's no place for me in this scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're all, as humans, driven by some need to feel connected, included. For our own basic survival, it was a necessity. And I often joke about my inner seventh grader, right? It's just, it triggers when workplace cliques or groups, things, clusters, like you described them, trigger so many of us and send us right back to those awkward middle school years when all we want to do is fit in, right? Do is belong. And so that fight or flight response really comes out in those situations.
Well, and it's kind of nutty because these are the same guys that I have no issue sharing jokes with and chatting with and in those one-on-one conversations being very comfortable and not feeling out of place at all. But you put them all in a big group and I don't know, it's just different.
Well, I suppose the good news to some extent is that there are no big groups happening right now. But what I was going to say beyond that is that I think it's helpful. I mean, for me, one of my driving focus areas for career success is always building relationships, right? And so you have had the benefit of being able to build these relationships in settings that are more comfortable to you, in one-on-one settings where you get to joke around. There isn't that more awkward group setting. And so to the extent that you have to be there, that's one thing. But I'm also a big fan of just really claiming your own style. And if you decide, you know what, these group meetings or group social activities just aren't for me, instead, maybe I make an appearance because it's the right thing to do, but instead I'm going to really continue to focus on building the relationships in the settings that do give me strength and make me feel more comfortable.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So what motivated you to want to tell your story today? And what are you hoping people will take away from it?
Part of it was kind of, as I said at the beginning, the fact that my very first thought at the idea of speaking on this podcast was, why would anybody listen to me? What could I offer? And that being the ideal reason to do something like this, because it doesn't matter on this topic or any other. It doesn't matter what the topic is. And it also doesn't matter if I am the smartest person in the room or anywhere else on it. There's something about my story and my journey that somebody can identify with. It just has to be that way. I've met enough people now that it's a lot more common than you think. And so part of what I'm hoping people get is that you really aren't alone. It's everywhere, and it's way more common than you think. And the other part is that I've worked so hard to get ahead of it and come out on the other side of it. And I'm doing that. And it's not easy, and it doesn't come naturally, but it works, which means if you're somebody who has the same kind of mindset or the same kind of issues and haven't been able to get through that, you can.
I'm so inspired by your story. I really appreciate that you were willing to have this conversation with me today. And I have no doubt that there are going to be many women who hear what you have to say and find that it resonates with them. So thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening today. If you're struggling with imposter syndrome and you'd like additional support, check out the show notes for more resources or contact me directly. I would love to help you. And if you'd like to tell your story, I would love to interview you. You will find my contact info in the show notes, so reach out anytime. Thanks again.